Hello everyone, welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to be taking a look at the new PTZ controller that PTZOptics released called the SuperJoy. And we're going to also look at how to leverage some scripting in vMix to amplify some of the capabilities inside of the controller. But before we get there, I want to invite everyone, please share your thoughts, feedback, any suggestions or questions you have in the comments below, and we'll get to them here on air. Also, if you'd like to join us here in the studio live via video, please, you can connect to the link at the bottom. It's also in the show notes. So you'd have the URL, and somebody from the studio will get you on air with us. So this would be great to have you. So anybody who wants to join, feel free. So let's get started. First, asking the question, why is it that you would want a physical controller? And there are multiple reasons for this, but I think the key ones are really around setting up each one of your shots and having that hand-eye coordination that you can get from moving a dial and sort of positioning with the joystick. That's a very natural type of thing for most people, and it makes getting your shots set up for any given event or production much easier than trying to do that through a mouse-based interface or something similar to that. The other thing is just having buttons in an interface makes everything a single push away. And I think when PTZOptics designed the SuperJoy, they really had this in mind because a lot of the functionality is laid out for exactly that type of use case, where you're one button push away from almost every key function that's available inside the controller. So let's see if we take a look at the controller here. It's actually a solid metal controller, a high quality joystick, and excellent tactile feedback on the buttons. Every time you have a button push, it gives you a click, so you know that you've successfully pushed the button for the operation you want to carry out. And there are actually a lot of different capabilities inside this joystick. And so if we just look at sort of the core capabilities, it does allow you to have one button access to any one of the cameras that you have set up. The cameras can be set up in different groups. So if you wanted to move through different groups of cameras, you can simply select a group, and then you have access to 6 cameras with one button push and 7 cameras if you actually do a few more button pushes to get that 7th camera. So that gives you access to 28 cameras inside the unit. It also gives you a lot of control around the granularity of movement with the joystick. So there are, let me see if I can get a better shot here. Let's see. There we go. So in this section of the controller right here, I have the ability to accelerate or decelerate everything for tilt, pan, zoom, focus, and moving between presets. So this allows me to dial in exactly the level of finesse that I want to have when I'm moving around in my production. So this gives me the ability, for instance, to do very slow tracking, where if I know I just have somebody walking slowly side to side, I want the joystick to respond appropriately. So if I push it hard, it will still stay at a more measured, slower pace to do that type of tracking. Now, in the joystick itself, it is pressure sensitive. So if I move it, a very small amount, it'll move slowly. And if I move it a larger amount, it will move more quickly. So you can do it with the joystick. So this really gives you almost that second level of finesse. And one of the other things that's really great with this, let me see if I can zoom in here, is you actually have dials that you can use for both focus and for zoom. Two things that you normally want to tweak after you've done the rough setting with the joystick. And you have that ability here now through these two dials. So again, another very well thought out application of space on the controller itself. And they're in a perfect position because it's just like the zoom controller on the upper part is well positioned for your right hand. These knobs are well positioned for your left hand. So you can do these things in concert. And again, the ergonomics are very well thought out for this. The other piece, if I jump back here, the other piece that you have access to right along this side are all the actual camera settings. So whatever camera that you have selected, you can do things to tweak the red and blue levels inside the image. You can do one push for white balance, so hold up a white balance card and put a one push trigger to set the white balance. You can also just loop through a set of preset white balances, again, making it easier to, if you don't have the time, you can get close to proper white balance in a more high-paced production situation. You also have backlight compensation and exposure cycle. And both the adjustments for color have a knob that allow me to just twist to do the adjustments. And the exposure cycle also gives me that same knob. So if I were to take, let me see if I can just turn the image brighter or turn it darker. You can see just from here, I have the ability to dial in the image I want. And I can do this in two ways. I can do it by doing iris adjustment, which will just shrink or raise the iris for the f-stop, or I can do it with shutter speed. So if I increase the shutter speed, the image will become darker because it's doing more samples per second. So there's less overall light coming in per sample. So you get two different ways to actually make that type of image adjustment. But again, very well laid out for dialing things in with more precision than you get in most other controllers that you have available. Certainly, at the price points that this is targeting, this controller is under $1,000. So it is an incredibly good bargain, and compared to anything else that's on the market anyway near that price point. But let's get over to sort of the meat of a lot of this. So if I come here, let's see. So right here is really the heart of what you'll be using in the controller. You have two sides. One is, these are the camera selectors. So you can see I have 6 camera buttons that are available here. The other thing I have right here are all my presets. So for each camera, I can have up to 9 presets configured here. And you also have the ability, let me see if I just move this up a little bit so you can see here. You can see I have another button over here called the camera group. And the camera group will let me select banks of cameras. And there are 4 banks that you can set up inside the SuperJoy. So that means those 4 banks and 7 cameras per bank means you have 28 cameras in total to control here. You have the ability, when you dial things in, to do sets. So I can just set a preset here and hit enter to store it. You can just do the direct recall by pressing any one of these buttons. So it's very fast to work that way. Even though you do have a call button, which lets you recall presets with, and I believe that's because you could have more than these 9 presets, and it gives you a way to do those additional presets through a more press-intensive mechanism, but it's still there for you if you need more than 9. But in most cases, 9 should be plenty. There's 2 other buttons right along here, which are really interesting. The first one is called Basic Mode. And what Basic Mode will let you do is it will let you select how much functionality you want to expose to the operator. So in a lot of use cases, you may have a more technical person setting everything up for all the shots that you're going to have and dialing in all the camera settings. But what you want is for an operator to be able to do a few simple things. So at the Basic Mode, it gives you two levels of control. The first one, if you press this once, it's probably hard to see, but the buttons you can now access are all illuminated here, and it gives you access to the joystick. So for an operator, the only things they can do would be select cameras and select presets, and then use the joystick to position things. The second basic mode, which you can press, limits this now just to camera selection and presets. So the operator, when in the second basic mode, can't move the positions, any of the positions on the camera. It's simply select a camera, select a preset. And this can be ideal because it means that you can give the operator comfort in knowing they can't screw something up. They can't move or reposition a camera and then not be able to get back. They can only use the presets you have set up. So pressing this a third time takes you out of that mode completely. There is an even simpler mode that's available here called matrix mode. And when you press matrix mode, what you get in the system is the ability to control the first three presets on the first three cameras in each group of cameras. So that means since you have 4 groups, matrix mode gives you the ability to control the first 3 presets on 12 cameras. And again, that's something that in these operator, amateur operator, or sort of non-professional operator modes that you may want to use this makes it very safe and simple for somebody to operate the system, especially with a limited number of cameras. They just really have 9 buttons, and that's all they have to do to leverage this. So there's more in this. Every one of the cameras that you get, you can control. Oh, let me just move up again. So we'll just you have the ability to control their on-screen display and move through and navigate menus. So any features or functionality that's on the camera itself, you can actually control that through the system as well. So that's a good overview of the physical aspects of this controller. But there are a few more things in this that make this really exciting. The first one is that this controller is a web server as well. So if I want to set up anything on this controller, I can do it all through a web interface that is accessible. So if I switch over here to the web UI, see. So in the web UI, you just type in the IP address of the controller, the SuperJoy, and go in. I just set this up as the default. You click Login, and now you have access to the configuration of all of the elements. So in here, you can see I have the 4 camera groups set up. I have all the cameras that I'm going to be using in this production set up as cameras inside these groups. And the configuration is, again, very straightforward. You'll go in, you'll say, what's the protocol? What's the IP address? And based on these settings, it does a lot of smart defaults. So you'll go in and tell you what's the correct port for that protocol. If there's admin functionality that you need to access on the camera, password protected, you can do that as well. The other thing that you'll notice here, and this will become very important for another feature, is if your camera has an RTSP feed, you can actually type in the password and IP address and port that you'll be using for that RTSP feed. And the reason that's important is that the controller will let you use that feed in setting up your presets. And we'll touch on that in a couple of minutes. So in setting up these cameras, very easy now to get all that done. Saves a lot of button pushes. You then have 2 control modes here. In the first control mode, it gives you the ability to select which group you want and then select the camera. And from selecting the camera, you can select the presets. So what you'll notice, even though this is sort of laid out here on a large screen, This is the perfect layout for a phone. So if you wanted somebody to be able to control this SuperJoy or control your cameras via the SuperJoy through uh, a phone, they could do that. So you could have somebody sitting off to the side and just do those camera switches and preset switches. Very, very nicely thought out here, and great that the layout is designed specifically to address that type of use case. That's also true for matrix mode, which we talked about, which again would fit very well on a mobile device. And it gives you just camera 1 and presets 1 to 3 for each one of these. And again, you have the 4 groups of cameras. So all of those elements are there for you. The next area is something called custom. And this is another incredibly powerful feature inside of the SuperJoy. So what these custom controls let you do are there are 4 custom buttons on the interface, and I'll show those in a moment, on the SuperJoy itself that allow you with a single button push to trigger multiple actions. So one action they have is something called a super preset. So for each one of these custom buttons, you could set up a preset which will move cameras to specific presets, not just one camera, but up to, I believe, 7 cameras here, and across all your groups. Oh no, it's 8 cameras, so excuse me, across all your groups. So this gives you now the ability to take in mass and set a whole set of cameras to go and focus on a new location. And even more significant, and something we will be using, is you have the ability to issue HTTP triggers. If you can trigger an action on an external device using an HTTP command, you can actually set that up as a controlled preset. And we're going to be using this a bit later. This also has the ability to send other types of TCP commands. You can send things which are just pure HTTP triggers and send multiple of them simultaneously. So this means if you wanted to control multiple devices. So one of the examples that if you've watched any of the PTZOptics discussions about the SuperJoy, they have things where they'll turn on lights and use that for different types of control. But this would also be ideal for driving something like central control, where you could trigger all different types of actions through these types of interfaces. So again, very, very powerful controls inside the SuperJoy. So the last thing are all the settings. So I won't go through all of this, but a couple of things to point out, which are probably very useful, is that you can import and export all your settings to a USB stick that would just plug into the back of the unit. And that means that you can save them and load different ones for different setups you may have. The other thing, which is really well considered, is that you have the ability to add different users with their own IDs to the system. And if you look at this, you can actually set up both admin accounts and guest accounts, which means that you could let certain people log on with limited abilities. So if you wanted people to be able to use the web interface but not be able to change any of your settings, you can set that up as well, just using different IDs. So again, a very well considered feature in this. So with that said, let me jump back and talk a little bit more about what you have physically on the controller. So one of the things that, let me see if I just jump here. If you look at the back of the controller, you'll notice that there are a variety of ports that are sitting here. So you do have all of the physical ports that you have over here for connecting if you're doing analog connections or RS 232 type connections to control your cameras. You also have power over Ethernet, which means that you don't need to have a power cord. And I should point out that if you are going to be working with plugging this unit in, you should not have power over Ethernet on the same device. So it's an either or, because I've been told you could damage the unit if you have both connected. But the really exciting thing is this right here. This is an HDMI connection that you have coming out of the unit. And if you remember when we talked about this initially, going through the setup for each of the cameras, we talked about the ability to configure each camera with an RTSP feed. So that is essentially the same general type of feed that you would use when you stream to a CDN. So it's very similar in nature to that. And what you're able to do with that is when you select a camera, if that camera has an RTSP feed coming out of it, this will show it on a monitor you can have that's dedicated to the SuperJoy. So David Ramirez is joining us from Costa Rica. David, thank you very much. We appreciate you being here on the show with us. So if you look right now, this is the output coming from the SuperJoy. So this is directly from the HDMI right here. So if I were to switch cameras, so I can just bounce through cameras, what you're seeing now are the different feeds that I have coming right out of the SuperJoy via RTSP coming from each of these cameras. So one of the key things to remember is that all of the PTZOptics camera lines, from their Z cams up through all their PTZ cameras, has an RTSP feed in addition to NDI or just SDI or HDMI that's coming out. So this is something that's baked into the hardware you'd get with any PTZOptics camera. Hence, it's a really great addition to a controller they have for, it's a general controller, but the fact it can leverage product unique features is great. And it is incredibly convenient because this means that the PTZ operator can, without asking to get a specific shot sent to them, they can adjust and dial in all of the different presets they'll need during a production without having the TD having to give them special feeds for the cameras. So very, very useful here. And it doesn't require NDI, which is another thing for those that don't have NDI equipped cameras. It definitely is very useful. So let me jump into a couple of specific use cases. And the first use case I want to talk about is something we just set up here that leverages multiple of these features, and that is working with a remote camera. So if I jump over here to a different camera group, so I now have, let's go right here. This camera is a Z-Cam that we have set up at a location that's probably about 80 miles from here in New York. We're in New Jersey. So what I'm actually doing is I am taking the RTSP feed from this remote Z-Cam, and I'm bringing that in via the PTZOptics SuperJoy, and I get to see and control this independent of any other signal coming in. So right now, if I want, not only do I have the ability to get this feed, but all of the controls will work as well. And so I now have the ability, now this will zoom in and so sort of zoom out and focus, but I have the ability now to work with the SuperJoy over a remote distance. So if you had people that needed to control cameras from a home location for, say, a church service, and they are limiting the number of people in the service, so they just need somebody who can do this remotely because they can't be there in person, this gives you that ability. And the other reason this is really exciting is that for the PTZOptics camera line, their latest firmware, and now I'm not sure the full range of cameras this will cover, but their latest firmware update for most of their Gen 2 PTZ cameras includes SRT, which is a transport protocol that works very well over the internet. And that means that you could actually switch these cameras and control and dial in the cameras all remotely using just protocols that are baked into the cameras themselves, no external gear needed. So this is very, very powerful. The only caveat to all of this is that when you set up a remote, you need to be able to do port forwarding. So you'll have to take the ports for both the IP control and for the RTSP transport, and make sure that you port forward those. But once that is done, you have complete control over everything. And this is very, very powerful for the types of things you could potentially do remotely. And when you consider that you have SRT baked in, all you really are looking for is plugging cameras into a switch with a port forwarded router, and I now can control and run a remote production from that location. So something very, very powerful. So the other piece then that I want to look at, and let me just switch over to the original camera group, is that I want to talk a bit about working with a production that is all local now. So I have that remote camera in, so I could be taking that feed from somebody remotely, but I also have a range of different PTZOptics cameras here that all have the same capabilities, the same RTSP feed coming in. And what you're seeing out of here is the RTSP feed coming from the controller as well. So if I move between my different cameras, each one of these is just the RTSP feed that's coming in here. And as I mentioned, you also have control over things like the iris and for color balance. So a lot of flexibility physically baked into the units we have here. And because of this, this gives me the ability with any one of the existing cameras I have to have full control all over IP with just a single connection coming out and the HDMI output for doing the visual getting the visual feedback I need to dial in different presets. But here's one of the things that especially for where we work with a range of different cameras to do different testing, different types of setup and product testing, that we were looking for some way that we could also dial in these capabilities using some type of visual cue. And so what we decided we would do is we would create a vMix script that let me rotate through all of the cameras that I'd want to control using the SuperJoy. And I would have this set up so that in the settings where I have the output configured, I would go and send all of these output number 2. So that would come out as NDI. So all I would need, in addition to the HDMI that's coming out of the SuperJoy directly, is I'd need, say, a laptop which was reading the NDI feed that was coming from output 2 in vMix. And so the way this actually works when we set this up is we have a name, the title basically of each one of the inputs. And so what we set up was a script that will read this and basically look for all of the inputs that are named C-CAM. So C-C-A-M. And that's basically control cameras. This is a camera I want to be able to control. So the way we did this was let me sort of jump over here and we'll do a little bit more scripting before we're done here. So the way we did this is we basically will look for all of the inputs and then find all of the inputs that use the CCAM in their title, and then create a rotation for that. So I can press a single button and it will just bounce through all of those inputs. So we start out by basically saying, what's the total number of inputs that I'm going to have to control? So that just gives us the ability to loop. And then I have to know, what's the active input? So I have to know which one of these inputs am I at when I'm toggling through them. So that gives me a way to know which camera to select. And so this is when I find that input, which one is active, what I actually want to then do is I want to use the key that's associated with that input. So if you remember inside the vMix XML structure, there is, for each input, there's a unique key. So no matter if things get moved around or inputs get shifted, it's all going to stay the same. That key is consistent for that save session. So it gives you more of a guarantee for selecting a specific input when you use the key. And that's all we're doing right up here. We're just initializing for all of that. So as we've done before, we set up and load the vMix XML, which is how we're getting all this information. And the other thing we're doing is we're using dynamic value 1. So that's a new vMix 24 feature that's been added. We're using that dynamic value 1 to store which is the active input that I have selected to send out that output to as a monitor for setting the PTZ settings when I'm using the controller. So this is the first thing that we're going to do that's a little bit new. We've talked about setting, pulling in nodes, an XML node from the vMix API, for the vMix XML via the API. And what that is, it's a single string of a full XML description. So for a single input, that would be something where it would have all the elements associated with that input. And that would be a node. But because we're potentially going to have multiple inputs we want to control, there's something else called a node list. And what a node list is basically a list of nodes. And you can access them through an index. So I can go in and say, give me the second entry in the node list. And that's the node I want to work with. So similar to what we've done in the past, but what I'm doing here is I'm going in and saying, I'm creating this node list, and I'm selecting a single node. Now, it's important here. The single node is vMix inputs. And so that basically is a single node with all inputs inside. And then I'm telling it to, with all of those inputs, select the nodes that contain in the title the letters CCAM. And that's all I'm doing. So when I go there, this now creates a node list with all of the inputs named CCAM in the title that I can then use to control. So after that, for the total control inputs, I'm going and taking that, we call that all input node list. So in that all inputs node list, there's a property called account, which is telling me how many elements, how many nodes are in that node list. And so this is just going to give me the ability when I want to loop to know how far to go up. And then I'm going to come in and I'm going to actually start to work with all this. So the first thing I need to do is I need to find out, well, which is the active node? So I pulled out the nodes. I have all this stuff set up. So I'm going in and I'm saying, let's first check what dynamic 1 node is, which is, that's basically where vMix stores the value for the dynamic values. So this comes back and says if there's nothing set there, or if the value that is set there is greater than the total number of inputs that I have, then we're just going to reset it. So basically, let's just initialize things. There's nothing there, or the value there doesn't make sense. Otherwise, we're going to go in and we're going to try to leverage what's there. But now this is the second thing that I want to introduce, which is very valuable when you're trying to write production grade scripts. And that is, we are going to come here and say, I want to go and loop to say, select the active input, but say that value wasn't correct. Say it was just some gibberish text or something else that's in there that sort of made it through this first test, but is still not going to work for us. What I do here, instead of just running this and potentially getting an error if the value inside dynamic value 1 wasn't appropriate, what I have is something called a try catch. And what a try and catch does is it said, try to execute this. And if it works, great. But if it fails, if I get an error, then catch that error here. And that's basically catch EX as exception. It's basically saying if there's some sort of problem here, you end up getting a callback, basically a way to handle it. And so what we're doing is, again, I try to use this, and if it works, great. But if it doesn't work, well, let's just go and we're going to initialize it again. So it gives us a great way to securely make sure we have the right input selected and not run into any errors. Because if we do, we're going to recover around that by simply going in and reinitializing it. So what I then do is I come here and I get the active input. And this is basically just, I set that dynamic value, which is positioning it now so it's ready for the next loop through if I come in here again. And then I'm just telling it, set the input key. This is what's the input that I'm going to be using to monitor, to adjust. I'm doing that through all inputs node list item. And this is effectively saying, let's just go and find the input key of the active input. That's all we're doing here. It's just getting the key out of the active control, the input that's active, and then assigning that to input key. And then we call a straightforward API function to set output to that input. So a lot of talking there, so I apologize for that. But what's interesting is if you look here, so let me just select this. Okay, so I have the custom button here, which I set up in custom. When we set up, if you remember, I set up the custom presets. I had an HTTP call, which basically calls this script we just set up inside of vMix. So if I press the custom one button, what it's doing is it goes to this first input, which is CCAM and full PTZ, and then it goes to the second input, which is over here. It says CCAM other, which is just another camera. And the reason this is important is because this camera here is not a PTZOptics camera, so it does not have an RTSP feed coming in that we can leverage. But now, if I need to switch to that, that will work fine. The other thing here is, say I wanted to do something where I want to add this camera in there too. All I need to do is change the name to add CCAM into that. And now, when I press the button, this new camera is now added into the loop. So it means I have a very simple way to loop through a preview of any of the cameras that may not work directly with RTSP and the SuperJoy controller. And so that means between the output of the controller and an NDI monitor, I now can see every camera that I need to control without having to ask anybody else to send me a specific signal. This gives me a lot of flexibility there. And there's hopefully some interesting things in the script itself that you can use more broadly. So, I see Matey the Great. So, hello, thank you for joining. I appreciate it. So, I think that's everything we wanted to cover for today's show. And hopefully, this touched on some things that were definitely interesting. I do want to point out that PTZOptics did send us this controller, but it was to work with them on different features and functionality and give them feedback around sort of implementation of features and layout and design. So this is something that as we started to use this, we actually became pretty enthusiastic about this and wanted to make sure that we at least shared that level of excitement we have with you as well. This is definitely, for where it fits in functionality and price point wise, we think this is definitely something that should be on your short list if you want to look for controllers for your PTZ setup. So definitely something to keep in mind. And I'm happy to answer any additional questions in the after show, post show. So that's everything. We will be back next week, and look forward to seeing all of you again. I also invite everybody to, if you'd like to hang out for the post show, we'll do that right after this. And again, if you want to join us for the post show and call in and be on air with us, you can just jump into the link we have below, and that should give us give you an easy way to connect, and somebody from the studio will get you on with us. So if I don't see you then, everybody, thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. So take care. Bye. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So this was a lot of fun. I mean, this was definitely one of those things where we weren't really planning on doing a review, and the SuperJoy wasn't sent to us as a review unit or some sort of spiff for a product placement. This is something that when we actually started to look at it and use it, we just became really excited about it. The functionality and the thought that went into this really is very forward looking. It's really designed around something that is IP centric. It does have all the capabilities for the analog setups, but it really is designed with an IP production mindset. And because of that, there's going to be a lot of things that we think will be expanded in it going forward. So, we've spoken with PTZOptics about several things, and we're pretty excited with some of the things they're telling us might be available for this. So it's not just sort of a hardware device, but it's much more of a software device that gives you definitely some future upside as they continue to refine this. But the overall view of this is definitely something we would use, and right now it is probably the nicest PTZ controller that we've seen, certainly for anything under $1,000, and realistically much nicer than things that are significantly more expensive than this. So please, if you're considering it, it would be something I would. If you're considering a PTZ controller, this would definitely be something I would take a look at. So the other thing that we touched on here was with the scripting. We wanted, even though we were doing a review show, we wanted to make sure that we covered a few of the more geeky things that we like to touch on, especially around scripting. And there were a few things in here that I think are interesting. One of those is the node list as a construct, because there are a lot of things inside of vMix that are perfect for these types of lists. And things like dynamic values are a perfect example. There'll be things where you'll have dynamics, and then you can have a list under that. And that list is something that you can work with an index. So something very interesting there as you start to think of your own scripting. There could really be some use cases here that could be very applicable to everything from setting up scoreboards where you have lists of players to other things that are more operational and control based. The other thing, which I didn't talk about during the show itself, but is for the math geeks among us here, is the function we used to figure out how to do the looping. And for the active control index we set up here, what we're using is a function called modulo. And what modulo is it basically lets you get the remainder from dividing one number by another number. So if you want to do a loop, if I have 3 elements in a loop that I want to go through, so 3 inputs in this case, what I do is I keep just counting up, so 1, 2, 3, and so I divide that by the total number of inputs. So when I'm at 1, I divide it by 3, and so you get 0 with a remainder of 1, divided by 2, divided by 3, 0 with a remainder 2. 3 is 1 with a remainder of 0. So now what I'm doing here is I have a 0, 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, which is kind of the indexation scheme that we're looking for here. And because I do that, it gives me this guarantee that I never run past the end of the loop and touch something that is basically a non-valid value. So that's all modulo is, but it can be useful for these types of things where you're looping around a number and you just want a result that sort of goes back to the beginning. Simplifies the logic a lot, but a little bit of a math trick there for what we did. And the other thing is this try catch, which can be very, very useful, because if you do have errors, this gives you the ability to recover elegantly. So, failing with style, or, so, and because you can do that, it means that you will never find yourself in a position where your script just dies, but you'll always be in a position where you can get yourself in a script, even if it has problems, back to a known state that you can work with in your production. And so that's all we did here. And what we have in this catch can actually be more than a single statement. We just did this to do the initialization, but this can be more complex logic. So everything you have in the catch and in the try and the catch can now become a bigger piece of logic. So definitely something to keep in mind as you look at scripting. So I just want to open this up. I know this has been going on for a bit of time here, so I don't want to overstay my welcome. But if anybody has any questions or would like to join us, just please post it in the comments, and we'll take care of it now. All right then. I guess we're probably set for today. So thanks everybody for joining. Everybody who's hung around for the after show, I always appreciate that. This is a more comfortable, fun time to have this discussion. So that's always great. So we'll see everybody next week then. Take care. Thanks for joining.